It's okay?
Yes, welcome to our afternoon session. Now I have a pleasure to present our last but not least speaker, who comes a long way from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Vinitsky Seroussi, who is also a representative of Israel in our management committee in our action. I'm really pleased that she accepted to give a keynote for us, since she is a really excellent memory researcher. You know her from co-editing Collective Memory Reader, but I also want to mention her book Yitzhak Rabin's Assassination and the Dilemmas of Commemoration. The comment will be given by Thea Sindbeck, who is assistant professor at Copenhagen University, specialist on Balkans, and as you know, many of you know her as our vice chair of our action. Please start.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you. The bad news is that it's 2:30 in the afternoon, and a presenter got to be a magician, no less, to keep people awake. So think as if you're sitting here with your coffee or something. The good news, I'm the last talk, this is it. You're all free to go right after that, except those who have to stay for the meetings. So thank you, and thanks Barbara for the opportunity. A rather run-down three-story building on Tel Aviv posh Rothschild Boulevard is the site of a pivotal act in the history of Israel. This is where, during the first truce of the 1948 war between Jews and Arabs, just as the British mandate in Palestine was about to expire, David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of the Israeli state, officially declared the establishment of the State of Israel. More often than not, when I ask people in Israel if they know where was the establishment of the State of Israel proclaimed, they have no idea. Seriously, in a good, sometimes they can mention the city, they say that it's Tel Aviv. More often than not, they have no idea. A small group of dignitaries was invited to attend the ceremony, and a huge crowd of people waited outside the building, filling the entire boulevard. We, Ben-Gurion, read aloud, hereby declare the establishment of the Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel. By any reckoning, this was a momentous event. Yet today, it's very easy to overlook the nondescript structure where one strolls along the fashionable, refurnished avenue that Rothschild Boulevard has become. You can get a glimpse of the boulevard. If you do make an effort to find and visit the building, what strikes you immediately is how uncared for it looks. The once impressive hall itself is shabby, containing only a few antiquated and dusty commemorative exhibits, and the overall effect is one of disrepair and disregard. The Hall of Independence exudes neglect. And we all, as we all know and understand, by no one means nor should every event or personality be a candidate for commemoration. Most occurrences never leaves the sphere of their particular chronology, and only a very, very small minority stands out to become collective memory through commemoration. The actual declaration of the State of Israel is well remembered, as the photograph of David Ben-Gurion reading the text aloud is one of the most famous icons in the pantheon of national collective memory. And the date is formally maintained by the most central institutions in the country. In fact, we will celebrate it in a few days. What is overlooked is the site itself. The lack of interest in the site is particularly telling, not only because it's a public space, very visible and very easily accessible, but also because Israel has always been preoccupied with nation building and with the world's acceptance of its existence. Moreover, Israel has a deep cultural, political, and social commitment to and involvement with commemoration. Collective memory and commemoration are among Israel's organizing principles, a habit of the heart, if you wish. So we have here a mnemonic gift that is left alone or is left aside. How can one explain that? But by trying to solve this puzzle of the site's neglect, by trying to solve the puzzle of the site's neglect, I would like to suggest three fundamental elements without which no specific collective memory can be constructed, maintained, and sustained: agency, institutional standing, and the culture of the commemorating society. I further wish to expand our binary perception of collective memory, recollection versus amnesia, by calling attention to an entire range between these two extremes. Neglect is but one such station in that spectrum of a social world far richer than the polar one offered by memory and amnesia alone. In the time at my disposal, and I planned on less than 45 minutes, I would like to share with you the building history and consider the three dimensions of our model, attempting to explain the lack of concern from the past. My co-writer on this paper is a student of mine. She was a student of mine some years ago. We've been working on it, and I promised her for a while that I will continue working on it. So let me say a few things about 16 Rothschild Boulevard, a short history of the building. The modest building in Tel Aviv is one of the most important special losses in the history of the Zionist movement. In 1909, it was where 66 families held a lottery to allocate the plots of the land on which a new Jewish neighborhood was to be built outside of Arad Jaffa. Mayor Dizengoff, the first head of the new neighborhood council, and later on the first mayor of Tel Aviv, the city that grew up around that neighborhood, is said to have won the plot on the site of the lottery itself, where he constructed his private home. The house was Meir and Sina, his wife, Dizengoff, private residence until Meir's death in 1936. Towards the end of the 1920s, a second floor was added, and by 1931, a third story was also in place. In 1930, after the death of his wife, who was a devotee of art, Dizengoff began to realize his dream of constructing a center for developing aesthetics in Tel Aviv. They had no children, and as a memorial to his beloved wife, he turned his private residence into the city's first art museum. The Tel Aviv Museum of Art was accordingly inaugurated in 1932, and the city mayor Dizengoff retaining his residence on the third floor of the building. So he lived on the floor, on the roof of the art museum. The building was renovated inside and out in order to adapt it to the growing collection of the art it housed. It reopened in 1936 after Mayor Dizengoff's death. 12 years later, in the afternoon of Friday, May 14, 1948, a few hours before the British mandate came to an end, and shortly before the Jewish Shabbat began, the Tel Aviv Museum of Art became the venue for the declaration of the State of Israel. Jerusalem, which would shortly be declared as the capital of the new state, was under siege and could not host the event. Tel Aviv was the second choice, and the house on Rothschild Boulevard was also only its second choice. Be selected because it was perceived as safe enough to withstand the Egyptian air assaults on Tel Aviv at that time. As one of the guides in the building today notes, many of its main areas were on the ground floor, its windows were long and narrow, and its walls were thick. Another guide believed that the building was selected because, and I'm quoting from an interview, they were looking for a unique place, natural, not too secular, not too entertainment-oriented. The aim was to unify all the different Jews in the country at the time. 350 people were invited to the ceremony and were asked to keep the location secret. I wish I could show you a picture of the boulevard with thousands of people waiting. Apparently, people had no idea how to keep a secret. To ready the hall for the special occasion, the exhibition, at the time there was an exhibition of painting by Dutch artists, was replaced by a selection of paintings by Jewish artists. Nearby coffee shops lended chairs, and the carpet and the microphone were borrowed as well. At 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion read the declaration. Rabbi Fishman Maimon then pronounced a Jewish blessing, and the national anthem was played and sang. Afterwards, the chairs and other borrowed items were returned to their owners, and the building resumed the role of art museum until 1959, when its content were moved to a nearby Helen Rubinstein Pavilion for contemporary art. The Hall of Independence was then sold to the state and stood empty. There was some concern that the building might be torn down. According to the director of the Bible Museum, which occupied the top story of the Hall of Independence until a year ago, and I quote him, "When Ben-Gurion heard about the shape and status of the building, he was determined to use his power and to save it. He persuaded state officials to allow the Israeli Association for Bible Research to set up a branch there. The association paid no rent, but promised to renovate it and maintain the building." I will return to that moment of putting the Bible Society at the top of this place. In 1974, Tel Aviv Deputy Mayor Yitzhak Artzi, most of us in Israel know him not for what he did, but because of the fact that he is the father of a very, very, very famous rock singer. So we all know him as Shlomo's father. Nobody remembers Yitzhak Artzi anymore. Anyway, he wanted to build a museum in Dizengoff home to chronicle the 3 days that preceded the state's declaration, including the reconstruction of the hall where Ben-Gurion pronounced statehood. Artzi contacted the relevant authorities of the states which owned the building and the director of the Bible Museum, which gradually vacated the ground floor of the building and squeezed into the top the 2 other floors. A year later, Artzi wrote that, and I quote him, "The city of Tel Aviv, which has few historical buildings, cannot give up the site where one of the most central events in the history of our people took place. I hope the government decided to support appropriate commemoration for the sake of future generations." Talk about future generations. A year later, he was promised that a committee to establish such a museum would be formed. The plan was to reenact the Declaration of Statehood on Israel's 30th anniversary, and indeed, the hall was opened in 1978. The renovation has been funded by American and Canadian Jewish organization and by the Tel Aviv municipality. For the next 30 years, there were calls, as well as promises by politicians for renovation of the site, especially before the annual Independence Day celebration. But nothing materialized, and the hall deteriorated and looked more and more old-fashioned, shabby, and really, really not well kept. In 2009, a member of the Israeli parliament tabled a bill for reconstruction and maintenance of the structure. The law of the House of Independence was passed that same year, and guess what? This year, the hall has been closed for renovation, and I'm waiting to see how my field will develop. Okay. Neglect and its model. I would like to suggest now that an understanding of commemoration and equally of the neglect of commemoration requires an analysis of 3 dimensions: agency, structure, and culture, and let me elaborate on each of them. Agent of memory, in our case, it's going to be the story of David Ben-Gurion, the founding father. Prior to and behind any mnemonic work starts agents of memory, who organize, you call them warriors, but I call them agents of memory, who organize, shape, and maintain the collective memory in general, and the mnemonic representation that allowed others to remember in particular. Thus, every analysis of a mnemonic practice, or lack of it thereof, should include a documentation and analysis of the work of people behind the text, the ritual, the memorial ceremonies, the museums, the monuments, any mnemonic practice that you can think of. The case of the Israeli Hall of Independence is intriguing, as we wonder not about who actually maintained the memory, but who could have been the agent of memory on its behalf, and why the site was so quickly abandoned. The most obvious agent of memory on its behalf should have been David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, who really liked to stand on his head, that was one of his things. He did some other things, but that was a major thing, stand on his head. The most obvious agent of memory on this behalf should have been David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was not only the most senior persona of the event, but probably the most powerful and effective political individual in the first decade of the State of Israel. While relationship between a state, especially in the West, and civil society have undergone changes that have affected the ability to shape and reshape past images and perceptions differently from the state-determined ones, this most certainly was not the case in Israel 60 years ago. Had David Ben-Gurion wanted to turn the site of the declaration into a memorable space, he could easily have done so. And our question is thus, why did he not? One apparently logical question is that when you are busy establishing a state, you have neither time nor energy to spend time on symbolic acts. That might well have been the case, as stated in an interview that I conducted with Yitzhak Navon. Yitzhak Navon was Ben-Gurion's personal assistant for many, many years. Later on, he was a Minister of Education in Israel, and later on he was the president, the 5th president of Israel. And he says in an interview to me, and I'm quoting, "Housing was needed for 750,000 immigrants who were arriving. The hall could wait. There were other pressing concerns and economic problems." Sounds pretty logical. With so much at stake and so many serious national tasks to accomplish during these early years, the Israeli government under Ben-Gurion nevertheless did find the time to establish national holidays, mnemonic practices and their content, including special detailed protocol for school curriculum that exhibited deep understanding of the importance a role played by the collective memory in the fledgling of the nation's existence. The 1949 legislation establishing Independence Day states that the Prime Minister is authorized to determine the forms of celebration and the structure of the symbols used. Such legislation so early in the nation's history attests to a political awareness of the need for symbolic dimensions as well, of the political sophistication to secure appropriate social mechanism to do so. Ben-Gurion clearly understood the power of collective memory in national building. In fact, he was concerned that there was too little solid common ground among the diverse Jewish groups then immigrating Israel for the kind of revolution that he and others had in mind, and he and those same others sought unifying myth, symbols, holidays, and history. Thus it should come as no surprise that Ben-Gurion had a deep respect towards those who paid the heaviest price for the Jewish state, the fallen soldiers and their families. As his personal assistant recalls, and I keep quoting Yitzhak Navon, he carried on an affair with the families of the fallen soldiers. There was not a single memorial text published about a fallen soldier that he did not read. He was profoundly moved by their heroism, by the beauty of their souls, end of quote. While his endorsement of the cult of the fallen soldier is not necessarily synonymous with a more general understanding of the role history and memory play beyond the ultimate sacrifice, it is clear from the amount of writing that he left behind that Ben-Gurion understood the importance of commemoration and how history is and should be written. And again, I'm quoting Yitzhak Navon. Memory was something that occupied Ben-Gurion from a historical and educational perspective. While he was writing his memoir, it was important for him to narrate how everything began. When he wrote how the state of Israel was born, he did it for the younger generation, who took the state of Israel for granted. They have no idea what came first, he used to say to me. It's very important, so I devote my time to these memoirs so the younger generation will understand. He thought it was very important when Eichmann was caught. He didn't care what the punishment was. It was important for the younger generation to learn about the Holocaust and the trial, which provided an opportunity to learn what took place before Israel was born. That is very important to know, Navon says. There was hardly anything he wrote that did not start with something historical. If he wrote about the desert, he began with a verse from the Bible. He used to say that things never start today. There is historical background, and he always made sure he made the link to connect us to ancient past. Past and present and historical memory must be connected to establish a basis for the future. Clearly, Ben-Gurion was a true believer in the ability of historical knowledge to shape present and future consciousness and commitment. But for him, such historical knowledge was very, very specific. It had to do with the Bible. Ben-Gurion was not an Orthodox Jew, on the contrary, but the Bible represented the ultimate legitimation for the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. According to the director of an historical museum in Tel Aviv, and I quote him, Ben-Gurion saw the link between the Bible and the site in which the state was declared as self-evident. He considered the Bible a deed of title to the land of Israel, a kushan if you wish. It was a mandate and a birthright. So if the Bible is the legal source for the state of Israel, the site of the nation's declaration of sovereignty should pay homage to that document. And indeed, the director of the Bible Museum adds that, and I quote, Ben-Gurion said that in the house where I declared independence, I want a museum confirming that independence began not in the days of David Ben-Gurion, David the son of Gurion, but in the days of David ben Yishai, David the son of Yishai, who is King David from the Bible. So Ben-Gurion considered the Bible the height of the Jewish creativity and sought to give it precedence in national education. He weaved phrases from the Bible into his speeches, held a Bible class in his home, and established an annual national Bible quiz whose festive finale is still an integral part of the official events of the secular Independence Day of the State of Israel. Thus, it is not surprising that when the building at 16 Rothschild Boulevard was in danger of demolition, he sought to save it by turning it into the Bible Museum. The result of this decision became apparent in the 70s, and it still, until a year ago, was a big issue because any decision regarding the fate of the building and the wish to reopen it and reenact the declaration had to accommodate the Bible Museum that Ben-Gurion effectively installed there in the 70s. Now, perhaps we could argue that Ben-Gurion nurtured heroes rather than sites, for which he cared little. This claim, supported by his new reverence for fallen soldiers and their families, which we mentioned, is however not congruent with the fact that in 1949, the government he headed established its most venerable national site, the Pantheon Mount Herzl. This site, with natural and landscape beauty alike, is the national cemetery that holds the remains of Theodor Herzl, considered the founder of the idea of modern Jewish state, which were brought from Europe. Also buried there are leaders of the pre-state Jewish community and Israel's president, prime ministers, and speakers of the parliament in a plot called the Greats of the Nation. The same slopes, if you know Arlington, so it's kind of the Israeli Arlington kind of thing. The same slope holds Israel's central military cemetery, war memorials, and a museum dedicated to Herzl memory, and a relatively short path between Mount Herzl to Yad Vashem, Israel's primary Holocaust memorial and museum. Perhaps there was no perceived need for another space marking the establishment of the states. What space, after all, could vie with the ultimate topographical Zionist narrative of a journey from the depth of hell through the valley of shadows of death to ultimate redemption in the form of a sovereign state? Thus, a sacred site, a mnemonic place, was indeed established, but it was not